So the other day, I was driving my girls home from daycare, and my 3-year-old Kaplan, she asked to listen to a story. It's a pretty common request for her these days after we found this great little daily podcast where a mom just reads kids' stories to her son. And so pulled up on Spotify, the story of the day is Emperor's New Clothes. Great, a classic. Put it on, and then, to be honest, I don't pay attention to the stories. I just, in my thoughts, sometimes focusing on the road too, that kind of thing. And so we're just driving, and my daughter, she said, "Hey, Daddy, can you pause the story? It's a couple minutes in." I'm like, "Yeah." She said, "Why did she say stupid?" And I had no idea what she was talking about. So we hit the rewind button, 15, 30 seconds, and sure enough, one of the characters in the story used the word stupid. It was one of the swindlers that was trying to trick the king and all the people into buying nothing to wear. And in our house, the word stupid is on a growing list of words we call grown-up words. What we mean by that is words that only grown-ups can use. What she means by that is words no one should ever use for any reason. In fact, I have to tell you this story. So I didn't know this, she was in the first hour, and she heard me tell this story. And then 45 minutes later, at the end of the service, when she saw me, she said, "Daddy, you said stupid on stage." Ah! Oh, busted. I'll deal with that when I get home. But for her, nobody says these words. And so, of course, why? Why did somebody say stupid in this story? And so me, fancying myself as like a good explainer of things to people, I started into this really long explanation about, well, honey, you see, there's a difference between the narrator of a story and the characters of a story. And there's different kinds of characters. There's good guys and bad guys. And sometimes the bad guys are in the story so that they can create the conflict that drives the plot forward. And one of the ways you identify the good guys and the bad guys is by the way they act and the things they say. And so with bad guys, they say things like stupid sometimes, not because they're examples for us to follow, but because they're warnings we're supposed to avoid, and blah, 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 right? I looked in the rearview mirror, and her eyes are totally glazed over. She's looking out the window. She doesn't care. Nobody cares. Like, what am I doing with this explanation? And so I just stopped mid-sentence, and I said, "Baby, you're absolutely right. She shouldn't say stupid." We hit play on the story, and she was right back into it, didn't give it another thought. But me, I couldn't let it go. Because the rest of the way home, I started thinking, like, these 2 little girls in the back seat, they're learning how to be human from me. How terrible is that? Like, how am I going to handle it? What am I going to do on the day when they finally discover I'm not perfect? I don't always have the answers. I don't always keep my promises. I don't always do what I say I'm going to do. It's part of being human. And then I started to think, well, how do you help kids understand that? How do you help kids grapple with the complexity and the nuance, the gray areas of life? And then I started to think, how do you help kids resolve the contradictions that emerge in our lives all the time? Like when people say and do things they're not supposed to, and they get away with it. And those questions, they've not left me ever since that incident, in part because I knew what we were going to be talking about today. Because let's face it, kids are not the only ones who struggle to deal with the complexity and the nuance of life. They're not the only ones who have a hard time resolving the contradictions that we encounter, especially when it comes to our view of God. I thought Joseph did a fantastic job last week in his message teasing out one of those tensions with this haunting question. Why do we pray to God for comfort after bad things happen when we know he could have prevented the bad thing in the first place? Is he in control? Does he know what he's doing? Because it sure doesn't seem like it right now. But there's plenty of others. What about, is God just? Does God really love justice? Because I'll tell you, when I watch the news, when I hear the stories about the things that are going on in our world, it just seems like a flood of injustice that never gets resolved. Is God really wise? Because I'll tell you, I would do some things differently if I was running the show. God is faithful, we are told. He blesses those who love him, and he curses those who stand against him and his purposes and his people. Really? Because sometimes I've observed in real life that unlike children's stories, the bad guys win, often at the expense of the good guys. Sometimes the righteous really do suffer unjustly at the hands of the wicked. Sometimes honesty hurts you and lying helps you. Sometimes it really happens. The manipulators and the cheaters, they get their way, they advance forward, and the people of integrity get passed over and left behind. Sometimes, as the philosopher Billy Joel once said, only the good die young. And the temptation for followers of Jesus has always been, in those moments of apparent contradiction, to look around and to ask this question: what's the point? I mean, if the world really works like that, then why am I trying to live like this? If breaking all the rules really is how you get what you want, why am I following the rules? And my friends who don't care at all about practicing the way of Jesus, you know what? They seem happier, healthier, wealthier. Their lives seem better than mine. What am I doing? If following God doesn't equal blessing, then what's the point of following God? This is the question. This is the thing that we have to wrestle to the ground today as we look at the third beatitude, the third statement of blessing by Jesus, which goes like this: blessed are the meek. You're going to inherit the earth. Of course, the first question we have to ask is, who are the meek? Seems as simple as just cracking open a dictionary and looking up what it means and seeing some synonyms, or humble and gentle and soft and passive and compliant, and there we go, we know what it means. But that's actually where the trouble begins for most of us, because if we're honest, most of the synonyms for the word meek, they add up to one thing in our minds: weak. Meek is weak, and we don't like to be weak. I have yet to sit down with somebody over coffee and we're talking about their faith and their spiritual journey and what's the Lord working on in your life right now, and they say, you know what, He's really making me weaker, and I'm grateful for it. I'm really growing in my weakness right now. I've yet to hear the story of the person who's sitting down for a job interview, and when asked what their greatest strengths are, they say, meekness. If you hire me, I'll never push back. Out of sight, out of mind, totally compliant. That's what you get when you hire me. Do I have the job? Nobody does that. We don't use the word meek. We don't like the word meek. If anything, you might be able to argue, we like the word humble. Like, we'll put humble in there every once in a while. We like that. But if we're honest, only really to a point. I was reading a funny article by David Brooks a few days ago, and he was kind of poking fun at one of the more recent and to be honest, more ridiculous cultural practices that has just emerged on the scene in the social media age, called the humble brag. You know about humble bragging? Or you see somebody post out on social media, our daughter just got Student of the Year. We are so humbled, we have no idea where she gets it from. Okay. I just got promoted at work, so humbled to be at such a great company. I guess hard work pays off. All right, got it. David Brooks writes this about these people. He says, the whole point of humility display is to signal that you are humbled by your own magnificent accomplishments. We can all be humbled by an awesome mountain or the infinitude of the night sky, but to be humbled by being in the presence of yourself, that is a sign of truly great humility. The key to humility display, he goes on, is to use self-effacement as a tool to maximize your self-promotion. It's easy to be humble when you're most people, but just think about how amazing it is to be humble when you are as impressive as you. Humility, he concludes, is the new pride. Probably right, I don't know. But I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind 2,000 years ago when he said this. Which presents a challenge, because it seems like with many of these Beatitudes, especially today, that Jesus is commending the kinds of people that most of us look down on. He's congratulating the kinds of people that none of us are trying to become. But that's only, I think, because we have started on the wrong foot. See, it doesn't really matter what you and I think the word meek means. The only thing that really matters is what Jesus thinks the word meek means. And to understand what he means when he says this, you need to understand a little bit of something about who he's talking to and where he is. So for starters, Jesus, in giving this Sermon on the Mount, he's in Galilee, which is the northernmost region of Israel, a nation that just so happens to be under occupation by the Roman Empire, the greatest empire in the history of humanity. The relationship between the Jews and the Romans is one of constant tension and tragedy. For the Romans, the Jews are an oddity. They don't really make much sense. They've got bizarre practices. They even believe that they're the people of one God, like one true God. And at some point, they believe that God's going to liberate them and that he's going to establish his kingdom and that they are going to inherit something like the world has never seen before. That's obviously not going to happen, but they can believe whatever they want over there in Israel as long as they keep the peace and keep paying their taxes. For the Jews, the Romans represent just the latest in a long line of empires that have subjugated and oppressed them. They are a glitch in the system. I mean, how else do you explain it? How else do you explain the presence of pagans in God's nation? How else do you explain the fact that idolaters are thwarting the purposes and the promises of God? This is a contradiction. And because of this, the constant mood in the nation of Israel is one of revolution and or liberation. But there is a lot of disagreement about what that's going to look like and how exactly that's going to happen. You see, for some Jews, like the Pharisees, they took the posture of activism. For them, the very presence of the Romans in their country, it's an affront, it's an offense. And so their primary task, their primary goal is to call the people of God to covenant faithfulness. We've got to keep focused on the law. We've got to hold fast to the traditions of our people. The main thing that we need to do is remain pure and distinct as we wait for the kingdom of God. Others, though, they took a different posture. They took the posture of combat. This would be like the Zealots, some of which followed Jesus. For them, they believed that God tends to answer the prayers of those with the sharpest swords. And the best way to see ourselves into the future is through holy war against our enemies. Not to be outdone, though, you have another posture, the posture of detachment. This would be like the Essenes, the people who looked out at what was going on in the world and they said, we cannot be corrupted by this culture. We cannot be polluted by sin. Pack your things, we're leaving. We cannot risk engaging and being intertangled with the systems and the culture of the empire. So we're going to go off and do our thing, and when God arrives, he'll deal with those sinners over there. And then the fourth posture that dominated was compromise. This was like the Sadducees, the very practical ones. They looked out and said, we think that God mainly helps those who help themselves. And the best thing that we can do to help ourselves, yeah, we should remain Jewish and all that, but if we need to adopt other things or adapt over here, we'll do that. We just need to keep the peace, and when God arrives, he's gonna sort it all out. And what you need to know is that when Jesus launches his public ministry, it's an open question as to which one of these groups is right. Which posture is going to prevail into the future? It's an open question. But one thing is for absolute certain. The vast majority of people who have gathered to hear Jesus today, they're not in any of these four groups. You see, in Jesus' world, very few people actually had their hands on the levers of power and influence such that they could shape the character and the direction of the nation of Israel. The vast, vast majority of people, they are poor and uneducated. They will be born into small towns and rural villages They'll grow up learning the family business, maybe something like fishing or farming, something in day labor like a carpenter maybe. They will start families, they will raise kids, they will pass on the family business, and then they'll die. They are the nameless and faceless masses that make up society. They are not the only ones who've gathered on this occasion to hear Jesus, though. They are joined by the desperate and the destitute, the ultra poor, the widow, the orphan, the prostitute, the tax collector, and the sinner. Those who are sick, those who are crippled, lame, blind, those who are dying. These are the kinds of people that Jesus is looking at when he says, blessed are the meek. You see, meek really does mean all the things that we said earlier, humble and gentle and compliant and passive. It's all that stuff. But not necessarily in the sense which we normally think of it. We're not talking about a virtue that we just cultivate among many other virtues. We're not talking about humble brag humility that we praise in people who are impressively able to use their advantages without being consumed by their advantages. We are almost certainly talking about the kinds of people who have learned humility through adversity. A disposition not chosen by people with lots and lots of choices, but one thrust on them by their social location, experiences, and circumstances. As one commentator helpfully puts it, he says, the common quality is the state of powerlessness, the inability to forward one's own cause, and thus the accompanying sense that if God doesn't come to the rescue, then all is lost. All is lost. When Jesus says, blessed are the meek, he's not looking at the movers and shakers of society. He is looking at people, generally speaking, who have no power, no influence, no reputation, no education, no resources, no connections. Nobody's looking to them for wisdom, for answers, for hope, or for help. Nobody would even think to ask for those things because nobody cares what these people think. Imagine the moment with me for a second. Feel this moment. People who have never been congratulated for anything before. People who are not used to winning. No one envies them, and no one would definitely accuse them of being blessed. And yet right here, in this moment, somebody, maybe for the first time ever, looks them in the face and says, congratulations. Congratulations, you are blessed. You are just what I'm looking for. And that person just so happens to be God, who is there to announce the arrival of his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Can you imagine? Maybe you can. If I'm honest, I have a really hard time. Because almost nothing about my life looks like the lives of the average person that followed and listened to Jesus that day. Which creates a little bit of an interesting dilemma, at least for me, maybe for you as well. Is Jesus saying that I have to become like these people? I mean, what is it about these people in particular that makes them so worthy to inherit the earth? To resolve that dilemma, we need to consider the other thing that I think Jesus means when he uses the word meek. See, scholars and commentators, they basically all agree on something, that this statement is not original with Jesus. In fact, what happens to a Star Wars fan when you say, may the Force be with you? That's likely what's happening to these people as Jesus stands up and says, blessed are the meek, you will inherit the earth. They all know exactly what he's talking about because they know Psalm chapter 37. We don't have time to read the whole passage, but I do want to read the first 11 verses over you. It's for David. Do not be incensed by evildoers. Do not envy those who do wrong. For like grass, they will quickly wither, and like green grass, they will fade. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and keep faith. Take pleasure in the Lord, that he grant you your heart's desire. Direct your way to the Lord. Trust him, and he will act. And he will bring forth your cause like the light, and your justice like high noon. Be still before the Lord and await him. Do not be incensed by him who prospers, by the man who devises schemes. Let go of wrath and forsake rage. Do not be incensed to do evil, for evildoers will be cut off. But those who hope in the Lord, they will inherit the earth. And very soon the wicked will be no more. You will look at his place, he'll be gone. And I'll throw this last verse on the screen. But the meek shall inherit the land and take pleasure from great well-being. Psalm 37 is one of several in the Bible written to deal with the apparent contradictions that emerge in our lives when the promises of God collide with our expectations and experiences. Last week, you may remember that we said, God can handle this stuff. He can handle those frustrations, those complaints, those issues we have. In fact, he welcomes those things from his people. It's what practices like lament are all about. But the interesting thing here in Psalm 37 is this is not a lament psalm. This is not somebody who's complaining to God or trying to square that circle or just wrestling with their view of God and how they deal with the contradictions of life. Psalm 37 is a wisdom psalm. It's someone with enough experience in life. It's someone who's lived enough years to know that sometimes appearances can be deceiving. Appearances can deceive us. And this is something we all have to wrestle with at some point in our lives. When life doesn't add up, when things don't make sense, when I'm confronted with a contradiction, am I going to trust God or am I going to trust what I see? Am I going to trust my circumstances? And the deeper the contradiction and the longer we have to sit with it, the more likely it becomes that we start to question God. Is he just? Is he wise? Is he faithful? Is he really going to keep his promises? Is he really going to accomplish his purposes? And when that happens, when you start to question God, when your confidence in your path to blessing begins to fail you, here's what the psalmist says happens. You start to look around for alternative paths to blessing. And because we often see what it is we really want to find, you'll see alternatives everywhere. And when that happens, you will start to get angry. Angry that they're breaking all the rules and they're getting away with it and my life stinks. You'll get angry. You'll get fearful. What if we're wrong and they're right? What if we're missing out? What if we're wasting our lives? What if God's not going to actually come through for us this time? You start to get envious. You will start to look out at the world and wonder if maybe we could just be a little bit more like them. Maybe they've figured some things out that we need to pick up for ourselves. And the longer you sit in your anger and your fear and your envy, the more it changes you. And before long, you start to ask the fatal question, which is this. What if we used the means of the world to achieve the promises of God? What if? What if we did like they did it to get what's always been promised to us? And the writer of Psalm 37 is saying, don't do that. That is a trap. Let me tell you what I have learned. God is just. He is wise. He is faithful. He will keep his promises. So be patient. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. And whatever you do, don't break character. I'm telling you, the contradictions that you see, they are real, but they're temporary. Those parts of your story, those moments, they really are a part of your story. But your story is not the whole story. Appearances can be deceiving. You see, one day, God's glorious future is going to arrive in the present. And on that day, it's going to all make sense. His justice will be revealed, his wisdom, his faithfulness, it will all be revealed. And you know what? On that day, the people that you are so tempted to be like right now, they will not be standing. But you know who will? The people you've never noticed before. The quietly faithful ones who didn't lose their confidence in God despite the contradictions, who were never tempted to use the means of the world to achieve the promises of God. In Psalm 37, the meek are those just foolish enough to keep trusting the Lord even when it looks like they shouldn't. They are just naive enough to think that maybe God's thoughts are not my thoughts. Maybe God's ways are not my ways. And maybe he's up to something, even though I can't see it or explain it. And so while everybody else becomes consumed by their anger and their fear and their envy, while everybody else displaces their hope and compromises their character, the meek just keep doing their thing. They keep trusting the Lord. They do good. They dwell in the land. And they keep faith. For 1,000 years, the people of God comforted themselves with psalms like this as they waited for God to resolve the contradictions. And then one day, out of nowhere, Jesus arrives on the scene. He sits down on a hillside. He looks a bunch of people in the face and he says, "Congratulations. Blessed are you. The time has come." The justice, the wisdom, the faithfulness of God, they are all about to be revealed to you. Congratulations. You are so blessed. Those of you who never stop trusting the Lord to come through. Blessed are those of you who never broke character. You are blessed because now a time has come. You stand to inherit the earth. The word inherit, it's an interesting word. I was thinking about it because earlier this year we updated our will because the previous draft didn't include my second daughter who was born last August. It got me thinking about what is a will? In a sense, it's a promise. It's a promise that when my wife and I pass on, my girls get everything. The wealth of our estate, tens of dollars. It's all yours. And you know what the only criteria is for you to receive your inheritance? It's to be our girls. You don't have to earn anything. You don't have to achieve anything. The outcome is not in doubt. Even if the specifics of how it's all going to work out and when it's all going to happen, even though there's some questions there, the outcome is not in doubt. When the time to inherit arrives, you will get it all. As with them, so with every single person who calls Jesus Lord, whose life is hidden in Christ. Here's a few things that are not in question for those people. Is God going to keep his promises? Not in question. Is God going to accomplish his purposes? Not in question. Is the kingdom that Jesus brought 2,000 years ago, will it be fully and finally realized on earth as it is in heaven? Not a question. In fact, the only question that really matters for us today is this. Who are you becoming while you wait? Who am I becoming while I wait? Love this from Paul David Tripp. He writes, from the perspective of the gospel, waiting is never just about getting what you've been waiting for, but more importantly, about good changes in you that God produces through the wait. It's really important. How you wait while you wait makes all the difference in the world. And the thing about anger and fear and envy is they make you really bad at waiting. They cause you to become the kind of person who is willing to adopt postures and practices that seem like they'll get you to what you thought you wanted all along. But in the end, all they really do is jeopardize the whole project in the first place. They just undermine the ground on which you wish to stand. So don't do that. Who are you becoming while you wait? This was the question in the psalmist day. It's a question in Jesus' day, and God help us, it is still a question today because followers of Jesus still squabble over how we should wait. It seems as if we are constantly pushed and pulled between the activists, the combatants, the detached, and the compromisers. And I'm not saying that any one of those postures is naturally or inherently wrong, but each one of those is beset by the same temptation, to use the means of the world to achieve the promises of God. For the activist, the temptation is always to shove our thing down, to shove our beliefs down your throat until you either believe it or shut your mouth, instead of doing the hard work of winning hearts and minds. The temptation for the combatant is to fight our way into the future, to win at your expense, to win at all costs. The temptation for the compromiser is to look out at the world and say, you know what? If you can't beat them, just join them and compromise your whole identity and calling in the process. The temptation for the detached is to simply become aloof or apathetic towards the needs of the world and the people of the world, or to simply abandon their vocation altogether. And unfortunately, we don't have to wonder what this looks like in real life because examples abound. It's what happens when churches and ministries and Christians, for that matter, they cover up sin and abuse and scandal because we're just doing too much good. How's God's kingdom going to come if we get sidelined dealing with our issues? It's what happens when followers of Jesus start to dehumanize everybody who believes differently than we do. As in the case of when we spew venom and hatred and lies and everything else online, or at least support those who do, because man, that's how they talk about us. That's how they treat us. It's what happens when Christians become so consumed by politicians and politics because they think that the way the kingdom comes is by seizing political power and wielding the sword of the law to get what we want. It is ridiculous. It's what happens when our real delight is not in the Lord, but in our gifts and abilities, our doctrines and traditions, our theological knowledge, our experiences, our successes, the way we've always done things. That's our real delight, not the Lord. And over and against all of those postures, all of those errors, you have the posture of the meek. And there's two things as we close that I think makes the meek so unique. And the first is this. The meek are those who simply derive their confidence in Jesus informs their posture and their practices. See, since the very beginning of the Christian movement, we have had to grapple with the fact that we believe that God became human, but not the kind of human that we would have all expected. He was not born in the halls of power surrounded by the influential. He was born in a stable, surrounded by animals and shepherds. For 30 years, he was an unremarkable day laborer. For 3 years, that was his professional career, 3 years. And you know what? During that time, he just walked around and said things like, the first will be last, and the last will be first in my kingdom. When his followers said, hey, you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy those people who you don't like? Jesus rebuked them. And when they said, hey, can we use our position in your kingdom for our own benefit? He said, listen, The kingdom of God is not just a new name for the way things have always been done. We're going to do it differently. In my kingdom, people care more about serving than being served. When Jesus described his own heart, he said it was gentle and lowly. When it came time to receive his kingdom, to step into his royal authority as king, he rode into the city of Jerusalem humbly on a donkey. When he was accused, he kept silent. When he was arrested, he did not fight back. When he was struck, he did not strike back. And when condemned, he picked up his cross and willingly went to his own death. And in the eyes of the world, he was a fool. What a loser. What a waste. Of course, then he rose from the dead and authenticated everything he ever said and did. I love this. John ORTBERG writes, for his followers, his life example of Jesus meant that either Jesus was not as great as they had thought, or that the whole notion of greatness itself would have to be redefined. It would have to become cruciform. Precisely right. Precisely right. And for 2,000 years, the very best of the Christian movement has been built on this simple conviction that if Jesus won the essential victory by the means of a cross, then perhaps it really is the case that the way to experience the promises and the purposes of God is the way of the cross, the way of self-giving love. Which leads me to the second thing that makes the meek so unique. The meek are those who are learning to speak the language of the future into the present. I was instructed by this from N.T. Wright, very helpful in preparation. He said, blessing is not primarily about what God promises to do to someone. It is primarily about what God is going to do through someone. That's the point of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in particular. They are a summons to live in the present in a way that will make sense in God's promised future, because that future has arrived in the present in Jesus of Nazareth. It may seem upside down, but we are called to believe with great daring that it is, in fact, the right way up. So try it, he says, and see. Just try it and see. Which is so simple, right? You see, the meek, it's not just a posture chosen by those who have no choices, though it is that. It's also something that we can learn. But we don't learn it by looking out at the world and trying to become more like them. We learn it by looking at Jesus and training to become more like him. The meek don't inherit the earth as a consolation prize for losers or as compensation for hanging on and dealing with the contradictions of life. They inherit the earth because that's how people live in God's new world. May that be so of us while we wait as well.